touching many lives. The last three PRISM lectures were dealing with the idea of the other, like understanding the other. How do we relate to the other with respect to sexuality, Indianness, and translocal communication? Today, we are extending that quest in terms of understanding exclusion in the Indian economy. We are very happy that we have Professor Jayati Ghosh with us, and we have a surprise. We have Dr. Kanika Batra, who is doing the 5th LILA PRISM lecture at Alliance Francaise on the 17th, the coming 17th. She's talking about theatre and right to food staples in India. So this is actually a continuation of, continuing this this discourse. So it is such a pleasant surprise that she's here and she has gracefully agreed to be part of this session. So she will be anchoring this Q&A hour. And I welcome both Jayati and Kanika. And Kanika will introduce Jayati. So let me tell you a little bit about Kanika. Kanika Batra is Associate Professor at the Department of English, Texas Tech University. She specializes in post-colonial literatures and teaches and researches post-colonial feminism and post-colonial queer studies. Her articles have appeared in many international journals, and her books include a monograph on Caribbean poetry and feminist visions and queer futures in post-colonial drama, and her new book project is tentatively titled Post-Colonial Counterculture, Genders and Sexualities in the Prince. Over to you, Kanika.
Welcome to the lecture series organized by LILA. It is with great pleasure that I introduce Jayati Ghosh, who is Professor of Economics at the Center for Economic Studies and Planning, JNU, New Delhi. Since 2002, Jayati has been the Executive Secretary of International Development Economic Associates, or IDEAS, an international network of heterodox development economists. She is founding trustee of the Economic Research Foundation. Her current research interests include globalization, international trade and finance, employment patterns in developing countries, macroeconomic policy, issues related to gender and development, and the implications of recent growth in China and India. Some of her recent works include the books titled Work and Well-Being in the Age of Finance, published by Tulika from New Delhi, The Market That Failed, Neoliberal Economic Reforms in India, published by Leftward in New Delhi, Tracking the Macroeconomy, published by ICFAI University Press, Hyderabad. Another one is titled Never Done and Poorly Paid, Women's Work in Globalizing India, by Women Unlimited, here again in New Delhi, and After Crisis, Adjustment, Recovery, and Fragility in East Asia, published by Tulika in New Delhi. Her lecture today is titled Incorporation and Exclusion in the Indian Economy. I invite Jayati to speak on the topic, and I'm sure we'll all learn a lot from her talk.
Thank you very much, Kanika, and it's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to, I think in fact, what I want to talk about is probably going to fit in quite well with the overall discussion. If Rizia was saying that it's been looking at the other. And I think one of the things that is quite striking about the Indian economy, perhaps much more than many other economies, is how much otherness there is. In other words, how many distinctions there are within the economy across people. I'm going to close this if you don't mind. Across categories. Do you need this? Okay. Across categories, across people, across locations. In other words, it's not diversity so much as it is some form of segregation and of disparity, which is a very, very dominant feature of India and of the Indian economy. And of course, right now, as we speak, we are in a particular phase of which many have called the sort of ending of the growth story, right? There are all these alarmist things that come out in many of the magazines and journals about how we were on this wonderful trajectory and now it's all exploding, or it's dissipating and the good news is over and we are no longer going to be on this wonderful trajectory. I want to put a slightly different angle onto all this, and particularly I want to ask a question which puzzles a lot of people actually when you think about it, which is that here is this economy which for 25, nearly 30 years really, has been growing at a reasonably fast clip. And at least for 20 years, it's been seen as one of the fastest growing economies in the world, one of these miracles in Asia, which has withstood various kinds of global crises, and to the point where people were looking at China and India as the large success stories of globalization. That okay, the rest of the world economy, where all kinds of other things have happened, there's been more inequality, more instability, more fragility, they've had crises and so on, but China and India have been growing in a relatively stable fashion at very, very rapid rates of growth, much faster than most other regions for now 2 decades. Okay, so here is this macro picture of this vibrant, growing economy. And yet, as all of us know who live here, there's a lot that doesn't seem to quite fit in with that picture. So those of us who live here, we are constantly startled by the fact that unemployment persists, or that the employment that persists is incredibly vulnerable, fragile, and poor. That the nutrition indicators remain as horrible as they have been always and are down there with sub-Saharan Africa. That the health indicators are also abysmal, appalling, and not growing at a rapid rate. That the education indicators are also still really poor for a country, even at this level of per capita income. So many people have always found this, not always, have been increasingly finding this to be something hard to explain. What is it that allows this strange kind of dichotomy between this rapid growth, this picture of sustained expansion, and the fact that it doesn't seem to be feeding into all the things that you expect with rapid growth? More employment, better quality employment, more health, better nutrition, and so on and so forth. What's going wrong? Is it the case that we have this growth and there's a bunch of people excluded from it and therefore it's not working out the way it should? Or is it the case that it's the nature of the growth itself? And I'm really going to basically argue the second. So what is often said is that, okay, fine, we have this growth process, but you know, it's not been fast enough or extensive enough or widespread enough for us to reach everybody. And so that's the problem. All we have to do is just keep growing more and more in the same way, and eventually we will reach everybody. But we began with such a large, poor population that we couldn't manage to reach everybody in time. That's one classic argument, and this is an argument which you will find very often, especially in official circles, right? The government policymakers say this a lot, that you know, just give us more time to do this rapid growth and we can deliver. I'm going to argue the opposite. I'm going to argue that in fact it is because of this particular strategy of growth that we haven't got the other stuff. In other words, it's not an accident. It's not that we just left out some people. There was just some people got marginalized in the process. That's not what's happening. What's happening is in fact that they have been incorporated. But they have been incorporated on very unequal terms in ways that actually perpetuate or sometimes increase the disparities. And let me try and explain what I mean. So you see, when I say that this otherness is not just part of Indian society and polity, it's also very much part of the economy. That's the sense in which I mean it. And I'm also going to argue that this otherness that we have been talking about in society and polity is very much part of the economic otherness. In other words, that the economic trajectory, which is one that involves growing disparities, is also one that relies on these social inequalities, relies on patterns of social discrimination and exclusion, to create a certain trajectory of profitability. Okay, so this is in fact, if you like, a stronger position than just saying we got left out and give us a bit more time and we'll reach it. So what this is saying is that therefore it's not that we have to say, oh my God, this growth story is over and it's all a tragedy and so on. What we should be saying is that this growth story got the plot wrong and we need a different plot. We need a different strategy which doesn't actually rely on systematic incorporation that then excludes from the benefits. Now let me try and explain what I mean, because this is a very broad and general and sweeping kind of characterization, right? So you're going to say, oh my God, you know, what on earth? Let's consider different elements, okay? Now one classic feature of growth or development, and basically every economy that has grown ever in history has shown this, is that you move people out of low value-added, low-paying activities into higher value-added and higher-paying activities, right? That's what the process of development is ultimately about. That people move out of usually things that are in the primary sector, agriculture, fishing, etc., but at low productivity. They move out of that into higher-paying, higher productivity activities. And when people say industrialization, that's really what they mean. That's what they're hoping will happen. The remarkable thing about India, if you look at the long period, 50 years say, is that the share of the primary sector in GDP, which was about 60% at 50 years ago, has come down to about 14% today. Okay? Huge decline, which is good, right? We want that, we expect that. That's supposed to happen with industrialization. But the share of the primary sector in employment, which was about 60%, again, 50 years ago, is now about 53%. What does that tell you? That we haven't moved people out. In other words, yes, the share of the primary sector has come down hugely, but the people have not. People are stuck in this low productivity primary activities, not because they don't want to be out and doing better things, or not because the primary sector is such a wonderful place that everybody wants to stay there, but because we're not generating the jobs outside. So puzzle number one, why aren't we generating the jobs? What's wrong? What is this weird pattern of growth where we don't generate the employment? Because other countries that have grown rapidly have managed to do this. Japan did it, well, I mean, all the developed countries did it, but let's say in Asia, China is doing it now, has done it quite substantially in 30 years. South Korea did it, okay? How come the Indian growth story is not moving people out of agriculture into manufacturing, into higher value-added activities? What is the pattern? One reason for this, we could say, is because we did this in a phase of globalization where we end up using technologies that are developed in the north. Okay? And it's true that the technologies developed in the north use less labor. Now, that in itself is not a bad thing, because using less labor means higher labor productivity, and it also is a reduction of drudgery. So I'm not one of those people who would say, you know, we shouldn't be using the latest technology, because I'm all for reducing drudgery. I don't think we should be allowing people to break rocks with their hands and a chisel and, you know, doing incredibly arduous work in agriculture manually when you can get a machine to do it and all of that kind of thing. So yes, reduction of drudgery is perfect. But then you must find employment in other activities. So if you're using less labor per unit of output, then you should be generating enough output to employ everybody. You get the point, right? So in manufacturing, you must be producing more and more, and then the others should be moving into higher value services, not terrible services where they are, you know, washing cars in the urban areas or doing really low-grade, you know, activities in the rural areas, or the most dynamic service employment in India today. The most dynamic, guess what it is? The one which has seen the biggest increase in service employment. Any guesses? Sorry? Call centers? No, I wish. Yes, it's domestic service. Can you imagine? It's maids and housekeepers and gardeners and drivers. It's domestic service. It's the single most dynamic employer in the service sector, in urban and rural India, both. Okay, that's where the action is. Now, that's not the desirable occupation. That's not what I would like my daughter to do, for example. So it basically means we're not generating, even in services, even in call centers, which is not the best job in the world either, but even in call centers we're not generating enough of those jobs, okay? In manufacturing we're not, because we're not generating the volumes. Next question, okay, then why aren't we generating the volumes? Is it because China's taken over the whole world of exports and there's no room left for us? There's an argument, and it's a strong argument. It makes sense, right? I mean, they're crazy in terms of the volumes of output that they produce and so on. But that still doesn't explain it, because if you have such a large population where so many people are deprived of so many goods, then presumably you should be able to think of a situation where your domestic market generates demand for those volumes. That is not working, so some linkage is not working there on that one. That's number one. Number two, we are not able to move out. It's not only because we're using the latest technologies, but because we are not generating enough incomes among those who would actually ask for goods of mass production. Okay? Now that's where I'm saying that this pattern of growth is one that has generated inequality, and that inequality then, in a sense, feeds in upon the possibility of future growth, because it keeps the level of demand domestically lower than it could otherwise have been. Okay? So that's the first, the employment. The second aspect I want to look at is the food part, which is something that Kanika is going to talk about much more, but she's going to look at how it's been interpreted culturally. Let me just tell you what's been happening on the food front. And that's remarkable too. We begin, let's say 50 years ago again, as a country where most of the people are hungry. And if you go by the standard indicators, calorie consumption per capita, okay, BMI, I mean, you know, height for age, height for, stunting. These are the standard indicators of either consumption or nutrition outcomes. Then 50 years ago, we were really in bad shape. We had terrible nutrition indicators. Today, we have worse nutrition indicators. Unbelievable but true, worse, okay? Calorie consumption per capita lower. Not lower than 50 years ago, lower than 30 years ago. Calorie consumption per capita lower than 30 years ago. BMI on average, when we measure it, really bad. In fact, now they stopped measuring it. We used to have national family health surveys which came out every few years. The last one was in 2005-06, because I think the government doesn't dare check anymore in case we get even worse numbers today. Stunting, where we have the data, terrible. We're down there with sub-Saharan Africa. Gujarat, this model of development, it's down there with Somalia and so on. Okay? So we are talking about really bad nutrition indicators that get worse. In an economy where, yes, it's dynamic, we can't pretend that it's not dynamic. It's growing fast, there is GDP growth, we know that there is change. We can see it around us, we know that there is not a lot of investment. We can see around us changes in the structure of the economy. So, let's not pretend that it's stagnation. It's not. It is dynamism, but it's a peculiar dynamism that is persisting with low employment and terrible and worsening nutrition. Okay? Again, second puzzle, how come? This one I will come back to. I want to put it all together in one frame. Third feature of Indian, economists didn't like to look at all this because it really messes up our models, I assure you. But, the social patterns in India. And of course, when you think of social patterns, the one you really have to think of is caste. Because caste in India is this extraordinary thing that has, I don't want to use the word transcended, but it has, in a sense, it has nothing to do with Hinduism, right? It's there in every religion. It's almost like it's a civilizational feature of our society, and it is extraordinarily resistant to modernization, so-called. Okay, so we have a very complex pattern of hierarchy and social inequality, relational inequality in India, which is probably the most refined such system in the world. I don't think anybody can beat us in terms of hierarchy and discrimination. And yet it is one that is, it's pre-capitalist for sure. Many would argue it's anti-capitalist, but it has somehow managed to merge very nicely into the kind of capitalism we have in India. It's molded itself into the pattern of accumulation in India in such a way that in fact today the Indian accumulation story, if you don't look at caste, you really will miss a huge amount, which is why economists, we get it wrong so often, because we don't look at these things enough. Okay? Let me try and give you a few examples. Look at the major business houses and you will find it's not just that they are families and houses and so on. You will find that they are increasingly even the regional business groups coming from particular castes. You look at their pattern of accumulation. How did they grow? Where did they emerge from? Who did they get loans from? Where did they first sell to? Who gave them the initial push? You will find the caste networks playing significant roles. You subsequently look at their pattern of hiring, and it's unbelievable what you will get in terms of the homogeneity of even the workforce. These are things, by the way, it took me a very long time. I was, nearly 50 before I realized how significant it is. But you go to a major newspaper concern, or you go to a major media house, and actually ask people what their caste is, you will be amazed to find out how everybody just happens to be upper caste. Okay, you go anywhere where there is not an explicit system of reservation or affirmative action, and you will find it is completely dominated. Just happens to be that they are upper caste. You go, on the other hand, to segments of the labor market that are less attractive. Forget manual scavenging. That one we know it's caste dominated, driven by patterns of untouchability and all that. Forget that. Take sanitation workers even in the city of Delhi and check on the caste. You will be surprised at the homogeneity, but now at the lower end of the spectrum. Check on agricultural laborers or landless laborers in general in rural India. No surprises, again everybody's lower caste. Check on unskilled construction workers at the bottom, who are the ones losing their jobs because now as it gets mechanized, you get more and more skilled workers, and those skilled workers are never low caste. But all the unskilled fellows, the people, the men and the women who are carrying the loads on their heads and throwing things and picking things and still actually breaking rocks with their chisels and all that, lower caste. Extraordinary, but it really comes home the resistance of and the resilience of the caste system and its role in the economy. And I'm going to come back to that one. I'm going to try and put that together in a minute. But let me then pick up the next one, gender. We all know that we are not particularly an attractive society for women, okay? And I don't mean people like us, because actually we are relatively pretty all right, let's face it, women in the middle classes and professional, etc. Yes, we have physical safety problems, but otherwise we are not, in that sense, relationally deprived to the same extent. But overall in India, certainly the gender gaps are among the largest in the world. Gender gaps in recognized work, because by the way, most women are always working, it's just that it's not recognized and it's not paid, okay? But Rajasthan has one of the lowest rates of female workforce participation, not just in India, but in the world, okay? I don't know if any of you ever have visited a Rajasthani village. You will never find, I go there and I'm completely horror-struck every time, because the women are all busy. Somebody is herding the cattle, somebody is lifting the grain, somebody is doing something. They're all running around doing something, and all the men are sitting down on these charpai smoking hookah, So when you go there, you will find that there is this huge, unpaid, unrecognized female labor force, but the recognized labor force participation of women in Rajasthan is tiny. It's really low. It's one of the lowest in the world, 22% or something ridiculous, okay? That tells you something about the status in society. the recognized workforce participation. And of course, recognized work leads to recognized incomes. The relative income of women relative to men in India is, again, the lowest. The gender gap in most occupations, well, the average gender gap is about 60%, which is to say women's wages on average are about 60% that of men's wages, even at the same level of education and so on, and often even in the same activity. But in particular sectors, it's even sharper, which is again one of the highest gender gaps in the world. Again, women are often confined to certain activities and not others. That is to say, in particular areas, they're not allowed out of the house. So if they do something, they will have to do, putting out work, embroidery or something in the house, rather than go out and work somewhere. All of those issues come in. That too is something which capitalism in India has used. So what I'm arguing is that these are, if you like, pre-capitalist, certainly. They are, forget, I don't know what you want to call them, feudal, semi-feudal, whatever, doesn't matter. The point is, these are features that existed before the process of capitalist accumulation. They have survived 2 centuries of it. What is more extraordinary is that they have survived 2 decades of fairly fierce globalization, which has actually substantially relied on these very features to make the Indian trajectory of capitalism a particular, very unusual, very unique one. But a large part of the secret of the success of Indian capitalism has been this ability to use these forms of social discrimination and exclusion to create what we would call segmented labor markets. So you can pay some people much lower than you would pay others, and thereby to maximize profits and surpluses. Okay? This is something we do not adequately recognize in India. The fact, and also, when we celebrate certain kinds of things and we say we're so much cheaper, the software industry, for example, we're so proud of the fact that our software engineers cost, 1/10 of the same fellow, the equivalently skilled fellow in the Silicon Valley, say. Okay? It's not really that, or it is that, but the reason why they're cheaper is not just because of that particular engineer. It's because of the entire range of support services, which are really not even paid legal minimum wages. Which is to say the supporting infrastructure, the cleaners, the drivers, the cooks in the canteen, the security people, etc. The entire range of support services, all of whom usually, even in the top places, TCS, Infosys, etc., all of these are outsourced to companies which do not actually give minimum wages to any of their workers. And you're able to pay your software engineer a particular wage also because that engineer can then rely on domestic support services, which are also dirt cheap, which are also usually not the minimum wage. The cook, the cleaner, the gardener, the driver, the domestic staff, etc., etc. In other words, it is a huge underclass of society which is subsidizing these growth sectors. And it is able to, or the growth sectors are able to draw on this subsidy because of the fact that it's not just the existence of a very large labor surplus, but it's because there are these patterns of social discrimination that it can use to actually maximize its own profitability. Okay? So it is not that they're excluded. They are not excluded. They are people drawn into the system, but they're drawn in on these very unequal terms that perpetuate the distance, that reinforce the differences, and keep the relational inequalities very strong. Final aspect I would like to mention in terms of this exclusion and incorporation being very much part of the same thing is one that has got a lot of discussion, and it's to do with resources, broadly speaking, land, mineral resources, forest resources, and so on. And we all know that this whole recent rapid accumulation is one that has disproportionately utilized cheap resources. Okay? Some of it, it's, a handover of the public resource wealth of the nation to private companies explicitly, so you hand over gas fields that the public sector has discovered to a particular company. which I will not name, but it begins with R, and then having handed it over, that company then says, well, I don't like this price, so I'm not going to produce. And instead of coming down heavy on them and saying, you better produce or else, you say, oh, sorry, we will just triple the price for you. Even though it is now double the global price, because, you know, obviously you can't produce at this low price and so on. So there's that kind, which is open and explicit, but I'm not talking just about that. A significant part of the accumulation story has actually been the dramatic increase in extraction and exploitation of natural resources, and that in turn it's not just the public wealth that is taken, but it is actually physically people who are living there. People who earlier, let's say, accessed forests for minor forest produce. People who lived on the land, which has been discovered to be a place where there's bauxite deposits. People who are near a coal belt, and so on, okay? Development-induced displacement, as it's called, has been a huge feature of the last 20 years, and a very important part of the euphoria about India. We should not kid ourselves. A lot of this euphoria about India was driven by the fact there are all these nice resources waiting there to be grabbed, and there's a state willing to make it available to grab, okay? Central state governments also, there are all kinds of crazy stories. It's only now that you are getting responses from society, from judiciary, etc., which are making it more difficult. Which is one of the reasons why there's so much frustration. And, you know, everyone saying, oh, reforms are stalled, because now you cannot walk in and take over land. Now, there have been extraordinary cases. There has been a case where tribals had been fighting for preventing their land from being taken over by a company which I will not name, but it begins with J, in Chhattisgarh, and they have almost succeeded. The Chhattisgarh government overnight declared this area a municipality. And in fact, constitutionally they can declare municipalities. Now, it didn't matter that, in fact, there was nothing resembling an urban center in this area. It was suddenly a municipality, and overnight, obviously, you have no rights over this thing. And in any case, tribal populations don't have recorded rights most of the time. It isn't an accident that this tremendous growth of extremism, Maoism, etc., happens precisely in the areas which are still rich in these natural resources and where there are significant tribal populations, okay? And it is so little an accident that this is recognized by an official document of the Planning Commission, which actually commissioned a study to look into the causes of Naxalism in these 150 districts, and the study confirmed that there is a strong reaction of the local people, read tribals. Another form of social exclusion, discrimination, you see how it's all merging into the economy, that it was the systematic denial of their rights, the lack of redressal when these rights were trampled on, the lack of compensation and rehabilitation for any of the processes that displaced them, robbed them of their livelihoods and so on, which created this massive disaffection. So it isn't just marginalized, it isn't that they were left out. They weren't left out. I mean, you know, kash hota, if only they had been left out. No, they were incorporated. And they were incorporated in violent and often destructive ways, which obviously created massive disaffection, which is a thing that we're living with even today. Okay, now, therefore you get this peculiar kind of capitalism. It's a hybrid capitalism, as I said, that is unique. Of course, capitalism everywhere, in all economies it's unique, right? But we are uniquer than that, you know, we are uniquely unique, if you like, because we have this existing complex system. It's a system which has in turn been able to make itself so, shall I say, so essential for the capitalist accumulation process, that in fact the process of accumulation, instead of destroying these traditional social relations, is constantly reinforcing them through the way that it functions. So if you turn around and tell the software industry that, listen, now it's about time you stop using all these outsourced companies which are paying these dirt cheap wages, you have to actually have everybody insourced and pay them the minimum wage and so on, there would be outcry. They'd be completely upset. They'd say, we're no longer competitive. How dare you do this to us? In other words, it is a capitalism which is dependent on these differences. If you tell the garment manufacturers that you have to stop using this crazy putting out system whereby women sitting in their houses are dipping dyes for shoelaces that will go into Adidas shoes, or are putting sequins onto t-shirts that will become Benetton t-shirts, one can't even call it a living wage because these are piece rate wages. So you will get it, you do 100 t-shirts, sequins for 100 t-shirts, you get so many rupees. But of course, they will decide that 50 of those t-shirts are no good, so you will only get paid for 50 of them, although all 100 will be collected from you. Okay? We don't even have to travel far. I can't resist telling you this. We have to go, let's say, to Kusumpur Pahari area of New Delhi. Okay? Which is, it's a sort of resettlement colony, people who were taken from earlier Jugis, etc., and are now resident there. And a survey that was done in Kusumpur Pahari revealed wage rates that are unbelievable. And I would not have believed if I didn't actually go and meet some of these women myself, okay? Let me give you a couple of examples. A woman who in 2009 would get 5 rupees for, you know, those embroidered coasters. So every coaster you embroider, you get 5 rupees in 2009, okay? Dirt cheap, disgusting, appalling, and it takes you an hour, 2 hours to embroider this. Today, she will have to do 5 coasters for 5 rupees. Yeah, it's a fall in the nominal wage. There doesn't seem to be a bottom to this wage, okay? There are women who are working all day, getting their kids to help them, you know, 11 hours, 12 hours, and their actual return per day is 7 rupees, 8 rupees. I know, I would not have believed you. I mean, if somebody had told me this, I would say, oh, please, you know, get real. But it's true. I mean, I have actually met, experienced, talked to these women and seen the kind of thing they have, you know. So they will work themselves and they will get mobilized, you know, usually the daughters, but also sometimes the sons, everybody, to do this because it's a piece rate. The more you do, the more you get. The competition is now so severe that they are driving themselves down to, nobody can call this a living wage, I don't know what, to something, right? And it's seen as an addition to the income. Why? Because anyway, women are not seen as workers. You know? So again, so now what are you using? You're using the gender hierarchy to create this extraordinary thing. And if you turn around and say, this is no good, we demand that all these workers must be paid a minimum wage, even if it's a piece rate, they must get at least 40 rupees a day for doing whatever they're doing, etc. The garment manufacturers will say, how dare you? Then, you know, we won't be able to survive. All the production will move to Bangladesh or Myanmar or somewhere else. So we can't do this. So in other words, what have we got? We have got a situation where it's a capitalism that is very dependent on this strange pattern of hierarchy and inequality that exists in our society. Finally, let me just dwell on the global role in all of this, okay? Because remember how we were the hot favorite, we were the best destination ever, our finance minister made it to the cover of Business Week, and you know, I mean, everybody loved us. We were the flavor of the month for global finance for about 3 or 4 years. This is a very common occurrence, it happens to lots of countries, okay? It's, finance is, if you like, one of those it's a sort of a serial sexual harasser, if you like. It moves, you know, from thing to thing, from country to country. It creates a boom, which is a temporary boom, and then at some point it realizes that it's unsustainable or decides that it's unsustainable and moves, leaving devastation in its wake, but then it's moved to another country and created a boom. And of course, whichever country is getting it thinks that we are different. We are getting this because we're so good. We have a demographic dividend, we are a break, we are entering the world stage, we are these big shots. Okay, we are not like Thailand was, or we're not like Mexico, we're not like Turkey, we're not going to have that kind of crisis, we're different. So we had our boom, and of course now we're entering the non-boom, shall I put it, the phase where they don't like you so much anymore. And then suddenly the same things which they had celebrated before and which they had relied on, okay, let's make no bones about it. Global capital knew exactly what was going on when it was getting into those mining contracts, when it was looking for profits in various sectors. They didn't think that suddenly India had become this totally equal, democratic, fabulous place, right? They were exploiting the very things which they are now turning around and saying are disastrous. So today they complain about crony capitalism, but in the 90s or in the 2000s, they were the biggest beneficiaries of that. And it was that which attracted them. The ability to access resources so cheaply, the ability to access markets so cheaply, the ability to have governments who turn around and say, okay, this is now a municipality. They relied on that. And this whole thing about stalling of reforms that we've been hearing for the last 3 years is really because that has become more and more difficult. It has reached some natural limits. There's less and less that you can actually push down wages and so on. It has reached social limits. Social tolerance of this is less and less. It has reached legal limits. Finally, some rule of law is being imposed in certain places, whether it is Niyamgiri or it is somewhere else. It is harder to do these things. And so they're upset. So for a while they cribbed that, you're not giving us concessions, there's no reform, there's no movement, there's no vision forward. Vision, of course, always means, more private sector profit rather than the alternative. And then, of course, when they decide that there's no more money to be had, they'll move. But when moving, they're not going to say that we moved because we found something else somewhere. They'll say we're moving because it's your fault, because you're no good. Because you haven't done the following, and because you are a crony and corrupt and blah, blah, blah. And guess what? They suddenly realize that there are poor people in India, or that there's bad infrastructure in India, okay? Or that there's a bad road network, and so on. So we are now at that crossroads in the Indian economy. We are at the crossroads where that particular trajectory of growth is no longer available. We will not be able to recover that because, as I said, we've reached many of these limits, ecological, social, political. The inequality that it creates is another story, and that in turn has become a constraint. Because that inequality also creates a lot of anger, frustration, and resentment, which flares up in all kinds of ways. It flares up in demands for, regional autonomy. It flares up in terrible violence, often communal violence. It flares up in demands for local jobs, for local people. It flares up in a broader frustration of youth. There's so many young people here, I hesitate to tell you this, but it's such a bad time to be young. I'm sorry, but let me tell you why. Let me tell you why. We've had an increasing involvement of the youth in tertiary education, which is damn good, right? We all wanted that. We wanted more and more tertiary enrollment and so on. And in fact, if you look at the government documents, they're all celebrating this, that we've doubled tertiary enrollment. 2/3 of that is private. In some states, it's as high as 90% of the enrollment is in private education. Most of that private, legally it can't be profit-making, right? But actually it is profit-making. In other words, they're really charging you. So 2/3 of this tertiary enrollment is of young people, not even from well-off families. There are from families who have sold their land, or they've gone into debt, or they've done something to put their child into engineering college, the child into medical college, the child to get an MBA, in the hope that then they will come out and get a job. I don't want to even tell you the rest. you know, right? But when they come out and they find they don't get a job, then they're mad. Okay? They're mad as hell, actually. And they also have very little in terms of hope that the system will deliver immediately. And then obviously you get all kinds of unpleasant social reality. I don't want to put a very crude economic interpretation on everything. I'm not saying all crime and all violence is related to this. But I'm saying that this creates a very febrile situation where violence is not unexpected. Where little things can create tinderboxes. because there's a general undercurrent of anger, frustration, and so on. Okay, does this mean it's all gloom and doom and we should all just go home and take to our beds and so on? No. Because in fact, you know, as long as you had that growth trajectory, it was a bit hard to tell people that, listen, this is not what it seems. Getting that story across would not have been plausible. And believe me, I've been trying to say this for about a decade, and most of the time people roll their eyes and say, oh God, it's another crazy lefty from JNU, you know. It's really, people don't take you seriously, because as long as the music is playing, you keep dancing, you know. And in a sense, a period of crisis is therefore a period to genuinely reassess this trajectory and say, look, we can do things differently. We don't have to do it this way. We don't have to base a growth trajectory entirely on appeasing, placating, and incentivizing large capital, national or international. We can try and base growth on a more broad-based income expansion, where we're trying to raise employment, where we're trying to ensure that everybody gets a decent minimum wage and decent working conditions, where we are trying to reduce the gaps across social categories, across women, across religion, and so on and so forth, and where we spread the benefits, therefore, more evenly. It's possible, and if we have a discussion, I'm sure we can think of the many ways in which it can be done. But for a long time, that possibility has not even been considered, because everybody was so mesmerized by the smoke and mirrors of this accumulation strategy, where the GDP growth was the only thing that mattered, and if you got 9% and if you crossed over to 10%, you were in seventh heaven. It didn't matter that it didn't translate into food or employment or water or health or anything else. Maybe now we can actually start thinking of the things that matter, and then think of the economic strategies that will get us there. Okay, I think that's enough already. I'm sure there would be lots of heated exchange on this one. So let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Jayati, for that very thought-provoking talk. I want to open the floor to questions, comments, observations. I see many students here. Please provide a brief introduction, where you're from, which educational institution, and ask Jayati for clarifications or any further thought-provoking comments. Yeah, the young man over there.
Good evening, my name is Vamik Zia. I'm working somewhere, I'm working in the development sector. Vamik Zia. So, basically, ma'am, my question is that we have been talking about these 3-4 years of growth and where India had become a success story. So, there were a few economists who foresaw all these things, but then the fundamentals of that growth were always very temporary. It was being ridden by FIIs, who are never stable, who have created problems in a lot of other economies before that. Then the other thing that was there was remittances from abroad because of the reforms, apparent reforms which were there in the banking system. So why weren't the economists as a whole, why were they so optimistic about this whole thing when everything was so easily, anyone could see that these things are so temporary? Because there was no real growth in the output, there were no real indicators, there was a lot of inflation which actually made our actually deficit wasn't there. We were on a sort of a surplus because of the inflation. So why didn't the economists see it initially?
You know, economics is a very political subject, actually. I mean it seriously. I really do. I mean that, you know, there is no other explanation for why, for example, even in the United States, when it was so evident, at least from early 2006, that this bubble was going to burst, that the economists who said that this bubble is going to burst were either denied access to public media, didn't get tenure, didn't get into any kind of, you know, etc. They were essentially marginalized. And the ones who kept saying, no, no, this is all fine, were the ones who got promoted and, you know, celebrated and so on. And pretty much the same story, not just in India, but in most other economies, which is to say that economics is, somebody called it the second oldest profession, you know, that the mainstream becomes the mainstream by virtue of it serving power. It doesn't mean that there are no good economists, it's just that the ones who are telling it like it is will not get heard so much.
Yeah, my name is G.P. Bagai. As a layman, I have a couple of questions. Number one, you said that domestic services lead to very poor wages, even in the service sector. But I find that, at least in the metros, there's a constant complaint now among those who hire domestic services that the wages are shooting up. So is this only confined to the metros? It doesn't exist in the hinterland. And I'm talking about not wage, labor and all, I'm talking about domestic services. Number two, since you're saying that caste and inequality and discrimination is affecting growth, therefore you are implying that the only agency which can do it is the government, because they are trying to minimize discrimination, they are trying to raise wages, they are trying to give reservations. But then the opposite argument is that wherever they put their foot in, the productivity has altered completely. There is all kinds of corruption. And in fact, the opposition parties are blaming the government for the mess which the country is led to. And you have, in the Congress, you had the National Advisory Committee, where they have tried their best to accommodate the views on inclusion. And that has only led to welfareism, which has led to inefficiency, which has led to subsidies. And all this is blamed for bringing the economy down. So, do you recommend greater government intervention, or do you recommend something else so that the private sector gets in, but in a more efficient, less discriminating way?
Okay, two separate questions. You know, the perception that domestic service wages, it's true, it's a very common middle class perception that it's rising very dramatically and so on. I can tell you what the data tell us. The data tell us that real wages in domestic service are falling. Real wages, that is wages divided by inflation, are falling. Okay? So I don't think that's true. It is possible that certain areas, certain localities, there's a little increase, etc. Certainly in urban India and in rural India, the real wages of domestic servants are falling, and yet their numbers are increasing. Okay? Which is a combination of the fact that there's a growing middle class that can afford more domestic service, and growing desperation among the working class that doesn't find other activities and therefore ends up doing it. So that's on the first question. On the second one, you know, there are many different levels at which I want to respond to this. One is the notion that government is always more inefficient than the private sector. I mean, private sector can be remarkably inefficient too. So I don't think it is necessarily the case that all government activities are more inefficient than all private sector. It varies. It's a management question. You know, it's a management question rather than a sort of, you know, given in terms of the quality of the intervention. Does government spending of the kind recommended by, let's say, the NAC, which is to say the Food Security Bill or the NREGA and so on, is it welfareism which leads to inefficiency and corruption? Well, let's look at the spending. Let's say, for example, on the NREGA, which people go on and on about. They're furious about it, right? Everybody hates, I mean, not everybody, but the mainstream financial press hates the NREGA. They say it's full of corruption, it's a waste of money, it's just handing money over to the poor, blah, blah, blah. Number one, in fact, where it is working, it has actually had a significant effect. Not where it's working, which is not that many states. It's a few states where it is working well. It has had a significant effect in improving the bargaining power of workers, which is a good thing because they were not getting minimum wages earlier, and in providing some better infrastructure in the rural areas. Second point is, let's look at the total spending on it. It is currently not even 0.5% of GDP that we are spending on it. 0.5% of GDP, not even that, okay, that we're spending on this. But there's such a hue and cry on it. Compare that to what the budget and the finance minister says is the actual giveaway in terms of tax rebates to the corporate sector in every budget. The latest one, it was 5.6% of GDP. Okay, more than 20 times. And yet nobody says that's inefficient, which it is hugely inefficient because we're giving away all those benefits, but investment has been falling for 3 years. Every quarter, investment for the last 3 years has been lower than the previous quarter. So it's an inefficient subsidization of industry, which is not responding by increasing investment. But we don't make a hue and cry about that one. Consider another example. One change in the gas price, which now makes the Indian gas price 3 times the world price. Why? Okay? Which weird economic thinking and reasoning could, it's a very convoluted one, but they managed to find a formula. Sorry, it makes it double the world price. It is now, they took Japan as one of the kind of things which is the highest gas price in the world and made this peculiar thing which is now double the world price. We could be importing at half the price that we are giving to one company. And that's going to cost us, guess how much? About 70,000 crore. Which is double, no, it is more than double the budget allocation for NREGA. And it is about triple the estimated increase in the food subsidy for implementing the food security bill. Is that not inefficient? Is that not corruption? Is that not a sign of a waste of resources? But when we are saying we just want to ensure minimum nutrition to 50% of the population, everybody's up in arms saying there's a waste of money, it's welfareism, it's populism, it's I don't know what. It's just a civilized society. How can you claim to be a civilized society in the 21st century when half your people are hungry and have these terrible nutrition indicators? Surely we should be just doing something about that. But we're spending so little, it's completely inadequate. We're spending 1/3 of the giveaway to one company. And yet the discussion is all about this. The discussion is all about how terrible it is and how it's a waste and so on and so forth. So I think there is a, as I said, economics is political in a way. So this whole notion that the government spending like this is necessarily negative anti-growth, I do not believe. I believe, in fact, the food security bill can be pro-growth. Because if you provide cheap food to the population, then number one, of course, you're getting a slightly healthier population, but number two, you're releasing income for buying other things. So you're generating local demand for other goods and services, which will revive those economies. So it can actually have a positive growth implication, especially for small producers. So if we see it that way, then it's not anti-growth at all. It's very much pro-growth.
Oh, hi. This side. Hi, I just have two, they're not actually questions. My name is Annika. They're not actually questions, but I was hoping you could elaborate on 2 points. One, the fall in the Indian rupee. What does it really mean? And second, because we all have been very familiar with the fact that economics is definitely political, what are some things that we might be able to expect from this upcoming election year in terms of impact on the economy?
Okay, the fall in the rupee is, as I said, this is it's almost like a boring plot. It's a very formulaic story, in a sense, what is happening to India. I could give you, I don't know, off the top of my head, 35 different developing countries to whom this has happened. The story is basically like this. You get discovered by global capital, for some reason, whatever reason. It doesn't matter, but, okay? When you get discovered, you get a lot of capital inflow. That makes things very buoyant. Animal spirits rise in the economy, and for various reasons you get a boom, okay? In the process of that boom, and the fact of the capital inflow, what happens is that your currency appreciates. Appreciates means what? In real terms, it means that your nominal exchange rate divided by your price rise is higher than it would have been otherwise, okay? This happens, it happened to India also, but this has happened, as I said, to lots and lots of countries. So your currency appreciates. When that happens, okay, it's going to be a little technical, but let me just say it and then I'll explain it. The incentives in the economy move away from tradables to non-tradables. What do I mean? I mean that, for example, exports become more expensive and therefore harder to do. Imports become cheaper, and so producing import substitutes is harder, okay? So people do less of that. They do less of the export production or the import substituting production, and they go into stuff that is going on in the economy, that is not traded. Typically, what are those? Real estate, construction, stock market. So you could actually go blindfold into an economy that has been getting a lot of capital inflow and say, this economy must be having a stock market boom, a real estate boom, and a construction boom. Okay? We know this, what happened to us too, okay? Again, for a while this all seems wonderful, and everybody thinks they're different, so it goes on for a while, etc. But the counterpart of this boom in the non-tradables is that your tradable part is getting worse and worse, which basically means that you get a trade deficit, or a current account deficit, which gets larger and larger. At some point, this current account deficit is seen to be too large. Now, when that point comes, it can be anything. It can be political instability, it can be, the assassination of the president, that's what happened in Mexico. It can be a crisis in your neighboring country, that's what happened in South Korea. Or it can be Mr. Bernanke saying he's going to raise interest rates, which is what happened in India. It doesn't matter what the trigger is, but it's what's going to happen, okay? It's waiting to happen. And this is the process that has started in India. So the rupee depreciation is part of that general period when, there is a, if you like, a kind of forced rebalancing. And therefore the current account is going to be forced to rebalance through the depreciating rupee and through a domestic crisis and a slowdown in the economy, which will slow down imports and stuff like that. Then people will say, oh, but now it's better because now Rajan has come and he has calmed the markets and everything's all fine now and so on. It doesn't work like that. It's not that, it's not like bam and it's over. It's a period of instability, and it's a fragile period that ultimately has to resolve the hard way. Okay, and as again, I'm not saying that this because I'm pessimistic about India. I'm saying it's because it's a very well-known plot by now, and that's why such a surprise that people haven't seen it, because over and over and over again we've seen the same plot. So the fall of the rupee is basically Act 3 of that drama I just told you about. But this is a drama of 4 acts. Okay, it's yeah. Politics, what do we expect? Well, it depends on what comes, right? And frankly, on that one, I'm like the rest of you. I have no idea. I have some fears, I have some hopes, but I have no idea.
Hello, ma'am.
The lady directly in front of me.
Yeah.
Can she get a mic?
Can we have the mic?
Ma'am, my name is Aparna. I am studying in Lady Shriram College. I would like to draw your attention to my home state, Kerala, where a lot of exploitation exists in the tertiary sector. If you are a teacher in a private school or you are a nurse in a hospital, and when you are a woman, the level of exploitation is very high. So I just want to know, how do economics address the question of gender-based income disparities in tertiary sector?
It's one of these hugely under-addressed areas. And in fact, part of the problem is that very few economists will actually even look at this issue. They'll say, oh, you're some weirdo because you're only looking at all these wage gaps and things like that. So mainstream profession is not even looking at this problem. But I completely agree with you, there is huge exploitation at many different levels, especially for highly educated women as well. It's not even that it's confined to less skilled and so on and so forth. I don't think we can hope for solutions from the top. These are not things that change because people get a change of heart and they get all benevolent and so on. They change because they're forced to change. So these things do not change without significant social mobilization and political demands. And I think that this is one of those areas where, if you like, the social mobilization of women in Kerala has been very weak. Partly because, again, very low labor force participation, big surprise, highly educated women, very low workforce participation. And the way the culture of the nature of the remittance economy has created all these strange social patterns, the dowry has emerged and things like that. So I think it is really that it's not going to happen because of a change in the minds and hearts of the people at the top. It will happen if there is sufficient grassroots mobilization and, which is a longer struggle, as you know, but that's where all of you young people are so much more important.
Good evening, ma'am. I know my profession is not from economy. It's not far related to economics. But I want to ask, because we all live in this society, so there are human beings are curious, so question crops up. So my question would be, first is, you in your entire talk, achieve our Indian, you said achieve our Indian economy, our capitalism is creating a situation where these disparities are there, all perpetuated. I would like to ask you, all the global and everywhere, wherever there is capitalism, has it created a balance, or is it equally like beneficial to all the sections of the society? And another question is that these economic indicators we constantly refer to, are they actually authentic? Because many times I feel that it doesn't touch me as a person in the society. How do they come? How do they conclude whatever figure they come out?
Okay, no. Is capitalism beneficial? No, it's not. No. But I mean, that's too simplistic an answer also. Let me put it this way. Yeah, capitalism in every society is different and is molded by the features of that society. So you will get, for example, societies where the social tolerance of inequality is very low. The Nordic countries, for example, they are much more egalitarian in spirit, and there's a history to that egalitarianness, which means that capitalism in the Nordic countries is different. It doesn't function the way it functions, let's say, in India. It doesn't rely on distinction so much. It doesn't rely on relational inequalities to perpetuate distributive injustices in the same way. What I'm saying is that capitalism both responds to and is shaped by the social context. Okay, Karl Polanyi made this point, about the embeddedness of institutions and structures. And I think the point I was making about India is that because we begin with this extraordinarily complicated and hierarchical social structure, that the ability of capitalism to use it to its own ends and then to get reliant on that inequality to proceed is particularly marked. Whereas in some other societies where there is less social tolerance of inequality, it wouldn't have been able to work in exactly the same way. Okay? About the indicators, I don't know which indicators you mean, because we are only one small thing, right, in that whole big thing. So if you say, which indicator are you thinking of? I mean,
I can just remember GDP or whatever.
Oh, you mean when you say a GDP number and you say 10% and your own income is not growing at 10%, like that? Yeah, because, the trouble is, okay, by the way, no, the reason you may think this is also because a very large part of GDP growth in India in the last decade has in fact been in finance, okay? Which is, a lot of it is just asset bubble. A lot of it is driven, people in the real estate sector, houses get more and more expensive and unaffordable, but that is adding effectively to GDP growth, because when they change hands, there's a significant increase in the incomes. So part of the reason why you may feel that the GDP growth is something out there, but by the way, we will feel it much less, I assure you, than the unskilled worker, who is actually experiencing a decline in real wage. We will not see a 10% increase, but there are people who are seeing declines in their real wage at a time when the average GDP is going up.
I'm going to exercise my moderator's privilege and ask that we take a couple of questions together that Jayati can answer. So the gentleman on my left and then the lady on my center left. Thanks. Yeah. So maybe the two of you and then Jayati can answer and then people here.
There's a young man at the back. Okay, maybe we take 4 and I hope to remember them.
To my question, I'll just divert your attention to the other side of the economics, which is the geopolitical side of it. And if you're somebody, and somebody believing that economists and economics would probably drive our foreign policy in the next, say, 5 years, what would you recommend to the Indian government today in terms of the regions to focus on? Because if I look at, say, I would divide it into 4 parts, say, BRICS, the America and the West, you have Iran and all the oil-related companies, and Africa as a continent. Now there are issues with BRICS where we don't know the sustainability of it. There are issues with Iran that you have your geopolitical conflict of interest with the Americans. You have Africa where you're trying to play this catch-up game with China. And so where would you see in the next 5 years India focusing so that we can at least have a more coherent foreign policy along with our economic interests?
Hi, my name is Carolina. Is this on? Yeah, sorry, I couldn't hear myself there. I have a question which is related to one of the last sentences you said in your talk, which I found very optimistic. You said that it's possible to give every citizen in India a decent wage and hence a decent standard of living. And that reminded me of a discussion that I had with a couple of friends, and a friend of mine from Hyderabad, he said he was very concerned about the population, and he said that there are simply too many people living in India. It has to be cut down by 2/3 of the population, and what alarmed me was that he said, "Are you willing to die for this cause?" And I wanted to ask you what you think about that assessment of the situation.
Hello, good evening. This is Shikha from the Indian Institute of Mass Communication, and I'm not going to ask you something regarding your speech because I have an opportunity to speak to an eminent economist and a teacher, basically. So I want to have a query, answered by you. When it comes to GDP and growth rate, there is a school of thought that says that India must focus on the service sector because we're going to be a younger nation by 2030, and while Japan and China would be relatively older nations, we will have a huge population that is young, and so we must focus on the service sector. But rather than that, I believe that we're not working horses. I don't think that we should only focus on the service sector and help the West flourish while we are not actually putting something substantial, something tangible to our own country. So what do you have to say regarding this? Should India go towards focusing on only the service sector or the manufacturing sector that is actually going to help our nation to make something tangible? So that's my question.
Hello ma'am, my name is Arpita and I am from IIT. My question is regarding the rupee depreciation. I want to ask, can rupee depreciation be good for economy in the long run? It's like instead of focusing on the depreciating value of money, can we just not focus on the imports and our own industries so that maybe in the long run we can recover?
Okay, well, big range of questions. On the geopolitical question, what would be a coherent foreign policy in a context of a very changing global situation? Okay, since I've been frank, the first thing we should do is stop trying to get into the lap of the US when they clearly don't want us there anyway, right? And really look precisely in the directions that you mentioned. To say that, BRICS growth is not sustainable and all that is, I would say it's a bit short-sighted because potentially these are the growth areas, Yes, there are problems right now in each one of the BRICS. Yes, right now each one of them is facing a crisis of a particular kind and a slowdown and etc. But if you're looking at medium to long-term potential, this is where it's at. And it's not just stupid not to look at that, it's also, I would say that, it is precisely because the long-term potential is there, and precisely because all of the BRICS and several others, Indonesia and so on, Mexico and so on, have potentially huge domestic markets. It's not that we should only look out to them. We should be looking at our domestic market, but trying to do a concerted expansion. And if you do that, then you can actually end up in a situation where you are focusing on increasing your domestic demand, but in the process, you are creating some demand for these others, and that gives you a kind of growth-led exports rather than export-led growth. So the focus should be the domestic market, but you're looking more and more for channels in the so-called non-traditional economies. And it's not just the BRICS. African continent is currently one of the most vibrant, and there's huge potential in many of these economies. Many parts of Southeast Asia that India ignored for too long. So there is a lot of, potential in the region that we have not exploited adequately. What do I think about population being too big? In terms of population density, we're actually pretty good now. Holland, for example, has 3 times the population density of India. So why is everybody not going on and on about Holland having too many people? We are a large country, yes, with a large land mass and a large population, but it is the fact that we're a large country doesn't make it the population itself which is a problem. And to look at it in absolute numbers, I remember there used to be this big sign on top of the Ames building with the number of people. Is it still there? And it goes up every second, and you say, oh my God, billion, 1.679, oh my God, it's gone up another 21, ridiculous. I mean, completely ridiculous, really. First of all, one of the good things that Indira Gandhi or her speechwriter said is development is the best contraceptive. And it is so evident. As countries go up in per capita incomes, the fertility comes down, birth rates come down, and population increase comes down. That is very clear in India. Our population rate is coming down very significantly. Second, if you think of it the right way, a young population can be a huge resource. And that's what everyone means when they talk about a demographic dividend. Of course, you have to learn how to use that population properly. In other words, it's not just enough to have the young people, but you must have things for them to do. And that relates to your question in a minute. But to say that population is the problem is ridiculous. The reason we say that population is the problem is because, unlike Holland, we're not throwing lots of capital at the people. So our purpose should be to build that capital, which will not make it look like there are too many people. If you see what I mean. Your friend in Hyderabad was thinking of the city of Hyderabad, which feels really crowded, whereas the city of Amsterdam doesn't feel very crowded. Okay? Although it's in fact higher population density. Shikha, you're absolutely right. You can't avoid the hard slog of industrialization. This idea that we can just skip over the nasty bits and become a service economy, it was an illusion that was quite common for a while. But I think people are realizing that it can't be done. In other words, this thing that, okay, we don't have to do the industrialization bit, let's just get into services and we're all fine, doesn't work. Because in fact, you don't. You can see that in the Indian case. Okay? Now, also the notion that you can do it through a services led by the IT and BPO sector is even a bigger illusion, because the total employment today in all of that, hardware, software, BPO, everything, is less than 3 million. Okay? Size of our labor force, nearly 500 million. Okay? So we are talking a ridiculous, just about 0.5% of the labor force. It's not going to transform our problem. Third point, can we do it by the export of services? There's nothing wrong with the export of services, but if it involves a reduction of those same services in your economy, then that is a problem. And in fact, I remember having a fierce debate with somebody once. I was in something called the National Knowledge Commission, and he said, oh, we should train lots of nurses, because in the US they're going to need lots of nurses because it's an aging population. So I said, excuse me, India needs lots of nurses. We are hugely short of nurses, doctors, vets, basic services of all kinds, and we need those services, those skills for our own population. This doesn't mean that it has to be service-led growth, but that the process of industrialization must be one that creates a diversified economy and a diversified set of skills. So yes, you do train people for these service activities. If in the process you manage to export some, that's fine. But the purpose must be to meet your domestic needs, which are huge and very, very underprovided compared to the rest of the world. Is the rupee depreciation good for the economy in the long run? It could be if the fall of the rupee doesn't generate domestic inflation, so that the real exchange rate doesn't really change. Okay? Because if, for example, the rupee depreciates and then there is domestic inflation, you're still where you were in terms of the real exchange rate, but you are relatively poorer compared to the rest of the world. So, you know, when I was a child, I was a child at the time of the first big rupee depreciation, when it went from rupees 5 to 7.5. And of course, there was much breastfeeding and angst and etc. But I remember a period, therefore, when the rupee was first 5 rupees to the dollar, 7.5 rupees to the dollar. Then we all know, right? But right now we are talking about 65 to 70 to the dollar. What is that doing? It is making us relatively poorer than the US, surely, okay? Unfortunately, it doesn't necessarily deliver us greater competitiveness because it also generates domestic price rise. So it doesn't solve your problem of the trade deficit, or it need not solve the problem of the trade deficit. If it does, the only way it will solve it is if some people in the economy get even poorer. In other words, if real wages do not rise, if real wages fall, yes, then it will solve your imbalance. But it's not a nice way of solving the imbalance, if you see what I mean. Yeah.
Hello, I'm Rahul.
Yeah.
My question is it possible to be a morally upright industrialist in our country?
A morally upright?
Industrialist in this country. Two reasons. I would like to believe that when Tata got the land in Jamshedpur around 40 to 50 years, 60 years back, there could have been probably similar opposition, but however government gave him the land, and today we look at Jamshedpur and say that it's probably a model city in every aspect. That's what we would like to believe. Say when Maruti Udyog was being taken by people we know who took it, at that time I remember reading as a child some press statements wherein land was grabbed. But however today Maruti is the most successful automobile story in our country. Probably it has initiated the automobile revolution, which has probably generated so many jobs. Now to take a balanced view, do I say that it is not possible to be a morally upright industrialist in this country wherein the systems do not allow me to do things fairly, and I continue to, because in the whole goodwill of service to the nation, I don't want to do things which are wrong, or I think that it's a trade-off at a cost of a certain discomfort, sometimes inhuman discomfort. I need to do this because probably 40 years later, they may thank me for this.
Yeah. Myself Dilip. I am from the district Jagatsinghpur, Odisha, where the India's largest FDI is going to be invested in Bus Cover. Actually, I have doubt that now in the situation of rupee depreciation, if we allow the FDI and FII in long term, how it will impact the social inequality? Thank you.
We'll take a couple of more questions, and there is a gentleman to my right, and a lady right in front of me.
Thank you, ma'am, for the wonderful talk. I have two questions. I'll make it very short. First question, ma'am. We all know this, in spite of the growth process, there's this Dalit Chamber of Commerce in India, and they have been able to significantly reap the benefits of globalization. In the sense, ma'am, would you prefer a system where they're not allowed to import, or they're kept down, or where there is an opportunity for them to grow? In that sense, like Ambedkar had suggested, like capitalism was a bigger liberator than the socialist trajectory that India was taking at that point of time. My second question is on a lighter note. As Act 5 of the Indian rupee drama, would you like to take a bet on the value of Indian rupee? How lower can it go?
Thank you. I'm Sanjeev Srivastava. I'm from Institute for Defense Theory and Analysis. And thank you, ma'am, for your excellent talk. Very, very insightful. But my question is related to your comment which you where you said that this capitalism has chosen country by country and then exploited it and went on to other countries. Finance. So my question is that it appears at this point of time that most of the countries in the globe have been driven by this kind of pattern. And I'm not talking about India, but China and other countries also getting influenced by this kind of pattern. So what is the protective mechanism to protect ourselves from such exploitations, and what would you suggest? And when you say, considering our disappointing scenario at the moment, when you say that we have to reassess, rethink at this point of time, then who are we? Who is this we you're talking about? Is it only the top politicians or the bureaucrat or the common public? Can you just make a comment on that?
One last question. This is the last question. The lady directly in front of you.
One more.
Okay. Well, can we have Jayati answer these questions?
No, let's get these two as well.
Okay.
Okay. So consolidation of silos in our country economy, A, and B, the middle class resistance in accommodation. Perhaps these are two quite major achievements of past 40 years. Now, in this context, really, saying equality and justice are precursors in this country, is it farce now to say that? Is it really real? Part number one, consolidation of silos and middle class resistance. Ultimately, what we're seeing is a resistance by middle class in a wider way of accommodating. I mean, I can elaborate it, but the time won't allow. So, it's precise. I cannot be more precise than this. I mean, it's a simple question. Can equality, at this point in time, equality and justice, are they really precursors to each other, Are they really, or no?
Let's move on to the last question.
From LSR. So my question revolves around the issue of disguised unemployment in the rural areas, and as opposed to a sort of a capital-intensive growth of industries. So if the possible solution for disguised unemployment is the movement of employment from agriculture to industry. However, if we're using the kind of industries which are more capital-intensive, how do we achieve that balance?
Okay. Yeah, okay, absolutely lost.
The absolutely lost question.
Gaurav actually mentioned that health and food are correlated, positively correlated. If you see, use of pesticides and chemicals in food, it's going up, and I don't think so it is correlated. Types of food which you are doing on the table is not required. Secondly, second question is related to, in the morning I was just reading about Iceland. It's a small country, and there is interesting history.
Can you please speak into the mic, sir?
Okay, it is a small country, and it is dependent on fisheries. And most of the 20th century, it was a poor country till 1970s, and in 1970s there was a change in policy. Where before that anyone was allowed to fish. Then later they started granting license to a certain number of people that helped the country and it became rich. And the Human Development Index also went up over the years. And I think so in 2003 to 2007, banking, the three banks failed. But still the Human Development Index is high. So what they saw was the same fisheries on which they were dependent bought them good things. Same with India also. You might go out and say, okay, fine, exports and all. Whatever we have over here, we can improve those. Some kind of policy changes. because it can't be good for the country.
Okay, again, huge number of questions. Thank you very much for all these. Rahul, can you be a morally upright industrialist? Yeah, I think so. Why not? I'm not saying industrialists are bad and all that kind of thing, okay? What I'm saying is that the way the incentives in the economy are structured, it's not about ethics and morality. It is that the incentives are structured in such a way that those who are going to play by certain rules are less likely to be profitable. Yeah, that's the current situation. And in fact, the ones who are more profitable are precisely the ones who can either access resources or access lower wages through different means, or etc., etc., etc. Which is not to say that there are no exceptions. Sure, there are some exceptions that manage to survive, but the dominant tendency has to do with the way the incentives are structured. And in that, governments are complicit, very much. It's not good government versus bad private. No, not at all. It's part of a broader, as I said, story of accumulation and happening in a particular society. So I don't think I would like to interpret it in terms of being morally upright as an industrialist or whatever, because I don't think that is the issue actually. You're absolutely right. For example, the Jamshedpur, etc. We don't even know the terms of compensation for those who were displaced. Why Jamshedpur? The land we are sitting on right now, which was rural not so long ago. Okay, we don't know the terms of that compensation, but we also know that the more rapid the growth is, the more you get extreme cases of dislocation, displacement without rehabilitation and so on. And that once you move into recognizing the rights of those who have been local dwellers or had livelihoods and so on, that slows the process down. And of course, slowing down creates impatience. And there perhaps the ethics issue becomes a bit grayer, shall I say. Yeah. What is the impact of FDI on social inequality? Dilip, you're right, POSCO, it's a big one. But it's not only POSCO. I don't think we should blame only multinationals, because boy, our guys are quite something themselves. Huh? In other words, we don't have to look for exploiters outside. We can produce our own very, very, very well. But you are right that large companies, and particularly something like POSCO, which is a really large company, have much greater power and clout and ability to swing the system and ability to persuade government ministers to do things in a particular way and so on. But the case of POSCO, it's not just the land, because a recent CAG report, even Jairam Ramesh have pointed out that the public sector companies have been the worst in terms of displacement. The mining companies in India, without adequate, so that is a big part of it, but that's not the only part of it. For me, the biggest problem with POSCO is not POSCO's doing, it's our doing. It is that we are allowing them to take away iron ore, which is completely stupid, because earlier we banned the export of iron ore because we wanted it to be processed in India, because we wanted to industrialize, as these girls pointed out. And what we have done is handed over raw material to export without getting the benefits of this process of manufacture, which would give us not just the actual manufacturing, but it would give us knowledge, it would give us technology, it would give us synergies in production, it would give us economies of scale. We are losing out on all of that. Yeah? Okay, the Dalit Chamber of Commerce, I'm all for it, I think it's great. No, I'm serious. I'm not saying that we have to stamp down on all capitalism and destroy it and so on and so forth. No, I'm saying that the capitalism we have is a deeply unequal one, which it doesn't mean to say that there are sprouts, things springing up here and there, all kinds of unexpected things, because thank God we are such a diverse economy and such a diverse country. The very famous economist Joan Robinson used to say that whatever you say about India, which is true, you can also say the opposite, which will also be true. And certainly there are cases. There's lots of all that kind of good news happening, little bits of it. despite the broader tendency. But it is that, if we want to make it a managed capitalism that delivers some degree of justice, we have to fight for that. We have to regulate it. We have to mold it into that. Just as it was in Scandinavia, or it was in various countries. It's not just enough to say, okay, let the free market come and let these fellows come with their incentives and have their way with us. No, we have to actually regulate, monitor, to make sure that it becomes a more equal and a more just kind of capitalism as well, which is not impossible actually. The value of the rupee, I have no idea. I'm not a crystal ball type. But one of the things which is interesting, again, if you just look back at history, that recent history, whenever these countries enter this period of crisis, everything is driven by expectations. And the expectations are so fickle that they are completely determined by what somebody says or not. So some guy has announced, I think it was Deutsche Bank, that the value of the rupee they think is 70 rupees. So definitely we will have to get to 70. Because they have said it. Because expectations become self-fulfilling. Whether it goes beyond that will depend on whether some other fellow says it's even lower. So, this is in the nature of those situations. We can create a recovery for a while. Right now we have it recovered to 64 or something. It will go up and down for a while like that. It will get... The critical thing is that we still have this huge gaping current account deficit. And we have a government that doesn't seem to have a plan B. They have no idea how to proceed if their plan A doesn't continue. So to me that's bad news. To me, that means things can only get worse before it can get better. So, the value of the rupee, therefore, would also be linked to that. Who is the we that has to change? Well, clearly it is, ultimately it would have to be, these are decisions made by governments, but as I said, governments don't just make decisions because, somebody tells them something or they think about it. They make decisions because there is, if you like, a political economy that generates that decision. So when we say we, I'm saying that there has to be enough of a social demand for a particular thing that would force it to happen. And yes, it does seem that it's not there right now, but it doesn't mean that it can't be there. And particularly, if you look at Latin America, it's one of those regions that really, it was the laboratory of the neoliberal experiment. It did everything. It had been there, done that, lost its t-shirt over and over again, okay? Yet, within a decade, you find in Latin America quite a transformation in economic policy, which is driven by politics, which is driven by local demands. So these things can happen also quite quickly. When I say we, I really mean we. I mean everybody, including people in this room, in that sense, can actually change it. That consolidation of silos, this reminds me, this knowledge commission I was in, Nandan Nilekani was a member. He was also very fond of this silos thing, and he kept saying the thinking in silos, we have to merge it. But I'm very scared when you start merging, because then you get things like UID, so I don't know how to respond to that. Honestly, I don't. The middle class resistance, I don't think it has even begun yet. It's just incipient. Because all this decade, the middle class thought we were the winners. Let's say we are the middle class here. We were the winners in this game. We were the beneficiaries of this globalization. It's now hitting them that actually we are not. Them, us, whatever. So I think the middle class resistance is just beginning. And that's good news because, social change in India depends also on the middle class. If it doesn't get involved on the right side, it's not going to happen. So let's hope it does get involved on the right side. Disguised unemployment. That's a very good question, Arushi, because in fact that is a huge issue, and the point is really that you have to have industrialization that is simultaneously large and small. In other words, there's a whole lot of activity that has huge economies of scale. It's stupid to try and do a petrochemical plant in a small scale, or a dam, or something, etc. But there's a huge amount of other activity that can be delivered locally, both industry and services. But for that you have to create demand in the rural areas. One of the things NREG, again, where it's successful, has managed to do, which is really quite interesting, has created the emergence of small-scale rural industrialization. In Andhra Pradesh, in Tamil Nadu, where you're putting money in the hands of rural laborers, They're going to buy more soap, they're going to buy more, Maggi noodles actually. They're going to buy all kinds of things, and that creates more demand even locally, and they will ask for more services. So you really have to think of the two-pronged approach. And you're absolutely right that dealing with that massive, huge pool of rural labor is the critical thing there. Food, yeah, it's true, it's not healthy. But it's we don't even have enough of the bad thing, let's put it that way. It's certainly true that we don't know what we're eating and we don't know what the impact is, and we discover that there's this whole explosion of cancer and all kinds of other diseases, which is obviously also related to the diet. But it is also true that malnourishment in the form of undernutrition is still the dominant problem in India. And to me it's an unbelievable, appalling thing that we still have to be saying this in 2013, that half of our population is still undernourished. I mean, I think it's obscene beyond words that we can live with that fact and not see that it's something that as a society we have to address immediately. So yeah, you're right, but there is that. More better quality food, yes, let's put it that way. Iceland, okay, I don't know enough about the past, I know a little bit about that crisis, but let's not forget Iceland has 300,000 people. I mean, it's what, Greater Kailash or something? Please, I mean, we can't take that as a model for India, no?
I'm not saying to take that as a model. What I'm saying is India is, as you said, uniqueness. There are small areas. So basically, if we can be in small groups in the same place.
Yes, so you could imagine a situation where, let us say, fishing off the coast of Andhra or Kerala is organized differently. Yeah,
that's
sure.
one example, but this can be replicated for all the areas, not fisheries, but all the domestic industry.
That becomes more of an issue, right?
Domestic services. If you go to US, they get paid $80, $60 per hour. So
yes, but that's because the per capita income is out there also. And
so same thing can be done over here. That can be pushed up, and some policy changes can be brought about where these poor people, they can get more.
Okay, this is another huge area, which maybe another occasion we will expand on that.
Thank you. Thank you all for being such a wonderful audience, and thanks Jayati for that thought-provoking talk.
Very much, Jayati and Kanika. This was wonderful, a lively discussion. We are, as I said, because we are going to take this to different levels of public interface. This is such a wonderful lecture today, and it is so interesting that we've kind of closed with the question of nutrition and food, because Kanika is going to talk on the 17th. Cultural representation of this whole question, theatre and right to food staples in India. I invite all of you to be there, because this series has to be taken as a series, not just as individual lectures, because we are trying to holistically look at the idea of development and how things can be made possible. Thank you very much for coming, and good night.